All right. Hey, everyone. This is Kit Cabello with Americans Learn. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and hit that ring bell notification. That way all of you beautiful people are made aware when we upload new content. You guessed it, upon our YouTube channel. And today, we're on part 3 of this three-part series that we are also separating into 3 parts themselves. The Turkish Century Journey of the Republic, part 3 of the part 2. We're going to be finishing this up. The original content creator's name is Kraut, so please, everyone, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and support the original content creator. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. It's the one thing to do. So let's go ahead and get ready to play this video and finish off where we last left off, where the, president, prime minister, was the last president, prime minister to retire or was retiring, who wasn't an army general or a commander of sorts. So let's enjoy this video in a 3, a 2, and an uno.
Popularity increased so much that when his terms as prime minister came to an end, he became the first president of the republic who was not an army general. However, his terms in office did not come without shortcomings and failures. Özal was himself half Kurdish and determined to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict with the Kurds throughout the 1980s, and that he failed. The army was determined to end that conflict by military means, but another problem also hampered all attempts to make peace. In Syria, governing power had fallen almost completely into the hands of the ruthless Assad family, who dreamt of a greater Syria, stretching from the Sinai Peninsula through Lebanon and into large parts of Anatolia. To achieve such, the Assads would spend much
Well, all those who dream of an empire. Well, I think we all know the rest of that quote.
Of their time in power destabilizing their neighbors as much as they could, including Turkey, where they saw the Kurds as the best vehicle to do so. Starting in the 1970s, the Syrian government built an extensive network providing training, weapons, explosives, and bases for Kurdish terror groups, and then smuggling them across the border. The Turkish government and army mistakenly believed that the Soviets were behind it all, and it took them a long time to figure out that it was Assad's Syria, which would extremely sour relations between Turkey and Syria for decades to come, and really even to this day. Many abroad and domestically viewed Turgut Özal as the democratizer of Islam, the first to establish a democratic conservative Islamic movement that could act and work within the boundaries of a secular democracy. And even though this made him many friends, it also increasingly made him a lot of enemies. The army, who had helped and supported people like him when the decade began, viewed him with increasing suspicion. So did the secular center-left, which also disapproved of his economic liberalizations. The far right couldn't stand him, and the religious populist right, which gained more and more influence as
You try and be friends with everybody, and they all start stabbing you in the back. In life, the real sad truth is, oh, my phone's still buzzing. In truth, in life, that is, you are on your own, and that the only allies are enemies, and the only enemies are truly your allies. Guy couldn't make it, making enemies with everybody. But here's the thing. He didn't make any enemies with everybody. A lot of people just were jelly. I guess a jelly.
As the decade came to a close, also framed him as a corrupt phony who sold out on true Islamic virtues. However, none of his enemies could change his enormous popularity amongst common Turks. As such, it came as a shock when he suddenly died in office at the age of 65. Suspicions were voiced at the time on the mysterious circumstances of his death, but the state prevented any investigations. 2 decades later, his body was exhumed for an autopsy, which found that he had indeed been poisoned. Who, however...
Who did it? Who is the jackass behind it, huh?
Whoever was responsible is something that we will probably never know. The Hagia Sophia is a museum in Istanbul, though it has not always been. Built during the late Roman Empire of the East, it would be a
Oh, back when it was called Constantinople. Back when it was called Constantinople. Look at the glorious Byzantiums.
cathedral to Orthodox and Greek Christians for centuries as the largest Christian house of worship in the world. After the Ottoman conquest, minarets as the largest Christian house of worship in the world. After the
Don't look. Don't look. It's Constantinople. This is the most violent image I've ever seen. Shame on you, Kraut. And shame on anyone else that's enjoying this. This is horrific. I mean, why even rename something so beautiful? It's Constantinople. Don't look. Don't look, please. You can't look. Don't look. Don't look. It's terrible. Oh, gosh. I can't even see it. I can't.
The Ottoman conquest, minarets were added and it became a mosque. To the Ottomans, it became a symbol of their conquest of Rome. Its beauty is renowned around the world. And on a side note, my personal favorite part of it is neither Islamic nor Christian. It's this piece of vandalism, a line of Germanic text carved into one of the balconies about 1,500 years ago, which roughly translates to Hakon was here. The Byzantines bought slaves from Swedish Vikings as well as hired them as mercenaries, and one of these pagan Norsemen, called Hakon, seemed to have felt the need to leave his mark on
Well, he's a barbarian, but what do you expect from a barbarian? But it's kind of funny if you really think about it.
history. When Ataturk founded his republic, he kicked the imams out of the Hagia Sophia. It was to neither be a mosque nor a church. For centuries it had been the symbol of an Islamic empire, an empire that he had abolished, so he declared it a museum to the past. And as such, it spent its time throughout the republic. But during the 1980s, some guests started to appear. Necmettin Erbakan, the leader of the Islamist Salvation Party, increasingly started showing up in front of it, protesting that the Hagia Sophia must become a mosque again. Throughout the 1980s, he would rally there, railing against the decadence of the country's business and political elites, rambling about how degenerate women who refuse to wear the veil are, demanding the death penalty for homosexuals, railing against Christians, railing against Jews, demanding the return of Sharia, the return of the Caliphate, proclaiming that only through a return to Islam in state matters and policy and law can society be made virtuous and good again. And for most of that time, he was laughed at, seen as a clown, a relic from the past, as something that was slightly amusing. People, however, simply didn't notice how the crowds attending his rallies kept getting bigger and bigger as time went by. The 1980s had been the decade of the yuppies, new, rich, young businessmen who may have publicly extolled conservative virtues while not necessarily living up to those virtues themselves. With the growth of capital and wealth
Hey, don't let the shiny exterior fool you.
inequality also came to rise. The gap between the haves and have-nots kept growing, and more people eyed these developments with resentment. The left, who had usually called out such social inequalities, had been beaten into silence by the army. So it was the Islamists, in particular the Islamist right, who jumped on it as an opportunity, and then came the 90s. Throughout the 1980s, the abolished restrictions on financial markets and the opening to global markets, while the government still had a large budget deficit and high interest rates, led to a tsunami of money flooding the banking system.
Oh, I remember the 90s. When I was a kid, they told us there'd be a great future. If you caught the reference, that was from season 1 of Venture Brothers when they go to Gargantua 1. Ah, the dreams of a promised era not delivered.
With that tsunami, the value of the Turkish lira rose dramatically despite interventions in the foreign exchange market by the central bank to keep the Turkish lira weak against the US dollar. The very short-term nature of the high-interest government debt bonds, together with the rising value of the currency, encouraged the Turkish private banks to borrow in foreign currency, and as they dished out loans onto the Turkish economy from their newly available foreign currency, corporations, households, and even the government stood to board a debt gravy train. In short, risky but high-profit behavior. With the liberalization and its ensuing effects, the bank's ability to get easy money abroad allowed the continual postponement of what was, however, an inevitable end to that debt gravy train. As the 90s came, investors started to question the ability of the lenders to repay the vast short-term loans, and the system went bust. Just before the crisis in 1994, Turkey had unsustainably high debt-fueled growth, a currency which had increased in value against the US dollar by 8.9%, an increased current account deficit which stood at 5% of its GDP, and it had little foreign exchange reserves to pay for the imports it was consuming. The budget deficit was climbing too. To top it all off, high inflation and high real interest rates and a
Say it with me, folks. What could possibly go wrong?
weak banking system which was very much reliant on the global market due to their aforementioned questionable lending schemes. In mid-January 1994, Turkey's ratings were downgraded to non-investment junk grade, which started the capital outflow, which led to an even higher demand for foreign currency, causing the value of the Turkish lira to fall like never before. Finally, the government's insistence on lowering the interest rates to keep its own borrowing cheap gutted any remaining confidence and fully brought about an economic crisis in 1994. The Turkish central bank hastily intervened in the foreign exchange market and lost more than half of its foreign currency reserves to defend the currency and was left with a mere $3 billion to counter any future trouble. The Turkish central bank also hiked the overnight interest rates to 700%, and inflation rose to 103% compared to an already abysmal 60% in 1993. The consequences of that was a rush to the banks by Turks to convert their liras to dollars to escape the imminent collapse of the currency's value as lenders quit Turkey. The Prime Minister at the time was Tansu Çiller, the first woman to become Prime Minister of Turkey. But you won't find her praised or celebrated like other women who were elected to lead their countries as a first, because she is considered to be one of the worst Prime Ministers Turkey ever had. She came to represent some of the worst aspects of Turkish politics that had developed throughout the 1980s.
So in other words, like a Hillary.
80s. Over the 1980s, Turkish politics had become increasingly corrupt, something that was frequently swept under and ignored while the economy was booming. But when the crisis came, it could no longer be hidden. The extensive privatizations of Turkish national assets had often been done in collaboration with the country's wealthy elites, meaning that if state companies were sold off, they were often not just put on sale to the general public, but handed over to wealthy Turks and the country's business elites through pre-arranged backroom deals. Policies and practices that continued under Çiller, who was blocked by the Supreme Court when she attempted to privatize the Turkish telecom. She also managed to collect a considerable personal fortune while in office through probably not exactly legal means.
So, like Hillary?
She also wasn't elected but became prime minister when her predecessor, who was from a different party, resigned office to become president, representing yet another aspect of Turkish politics at the time that many found frustrating: the enormous number of political parties, several left-wing parties, several conservative parties with barely any differences between them, but for some weird reason this multitude still continued to exist, generating even more complex and insipid networks of varying political alliances and coalitions between parties and politicians. Adding to that, during her time in office, the conflict with the Kurds escalated drastically. She approved of what became known as the castle strategy, which was in essence a dirty war, meaning counter-guerrilla warfare, something that could be summarized as terrorizing terrorists, meaning to isolate communities that may at some point have produced a terrorist and to terrorize them in the hope that they would as a result not produce more. This included
That's not how it works. That's not how it works, because people want revenge.
the random shelling of Kurdish villages, arbitrary arrests, constant lockdowns and curfews, the cutting of basic infrastructure and supplies. But most controversially of all, she hired right-wing thugs and gangsters, including from the Grey Wolves, to carry out extrajudicial assassinations sanctioned not by the state, but by her office. It is in this chaos that Necmettin Erbakan's rallies started getting more and more traction. Railing against the corruption of the banks and the state, he set up his deputy, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, to run for mayor of Istanbul, who was initially
Constantinople.
laughed at, but to the surprise of everyone, won. The political establishment had been blind to one of the most significant demographic changes in the country's recent history. In 1950, only 14% of farm laborers had owned no farmland. As the agricultural sector moved into becoming a sector dominated by large landowners, it dramatically changed the difference in income. By 1977, 58% of profits made in the agricultural sector went to 7% of the population. The fact that produce was mainly grown for large-scale export also meant that large stretches of land were often unattended to keep the prices stable. Combined with the automation of the farming industry, the redundant farm laborers had over decades moved into the cities in ever-increasing numbers, in ever-growing slums with ever greater income inequality. In 1900, the population of Istanbul was at 1 million. By
Constantinople.
1960, it was at 1.5 million. By 1985, it was at 6 million. And by 1995, the population of Istanbul had reached 10 million. Today, it lies at 15 million. In Ankara, the population rose from 30,000 in 1923 to 1.5 million in 1970 and to 2.5 million by 1989. In Izmir, the population rose from 200,000 in 1930 to 1 million by 1990, of which 60% were migrant laborers who lived in the slums called Gecekondu. These developments were happening throughout all major Turkish cities, where these new arrivals had almost always been ignored and left to themselves by a political establishment that saw them as backward Anatolians. And what they realized far too late in the 90s was that these people could also vote. The political East-West binary of the Republic was thereby broken. Furthermore, the trend of privatization fueled this social conflict. For most of the 20th century, Turkish media was under government control or pressure, or was ideologically aligned with the existing Kemalist establishment, which made anti-authoritarian currents harder to organize, especially after the 1980 coup and crackdown. Arabesque music, for example, was outright banned for a decade. Turks had to tune in into Cypriot or Syrian radio to listen to arabesque music. Filmmakers, authors and musicians were either brought under state authority or exiled, such as Cem Karaca. The Turkish movie industry started by producing Turkified
The greatest work ever. There's Turkish Star Wars, Turkish Batman, Turkish Spider-Man, and Turkish Superman. And if you think I'm lying about any of those things, fight me. Fight me. I'm correct.
versions of foreign dramas or making cheap propaganda movies. This can be best seen in the swashbuckling adventures of Cüneyt Arkın, an actor whose movies included a hefty amount of anti-Greek or anti-communist messages, usually by a Rambo-like Arkın fighting his way through hordes of enemies and saving the damsel in distress from the
Yes. Hey.
Byzantine emperor.
Hey. Hey. Leave the Byzantines alone. Haven't you done enough already?
This all changed with the trend of privatization under Özal. In 1990, Turkey's first private television channel, Star TV, was launched. This changed Turkish society. Television was no longer a novelty. It became part of family life as people began to be bombarded by an influx of foreign news, movies, and music shows. The vast majority of the Turkish population was exposed to liberal foreign media for the first time. No longer was sexuality suppressed or people shown as monolithic enemies or friends. The Turkish youth of the 1990s, who voted mostly for opposition parties today, were raised with Western television and entertainment, but in time this led to authoritarian militarism collapsing. By 1995, the Islamic Welfare Party had won the mayoral elections in 6 major Turkish cities, and amongst them Recep Tayyip Erdogan began to make a name for himself as the mayor of Istanbul. A city that had for decades been neglected and plagued by corruption was made to shine. Sewage systems and water pipes were expanded into the poverty-stricken parts of the city, highways, bus lines, and increased funding for schools and sports. Erdogan built his political national recognition on the substantial changes and successes he achieved in Istanbul. From here on, he would start a career that would significantly change the country. The name Islamic Welfare Party was not chosen by mistake. Erbakan didn't just appeal to the voters through an appeal to religion as a cultural expression. Erbakan's political successes were built on a harsh condemnation of the modern republic. He decried capitalism and demanded a new social order based on Sharia that would respect the small farmer, the small trader, and would have a Sharia-based welfare system. Already during the 1980s, the Islamic Welfare Party had made a name for itself through soup kitchens for the poor. This model was the same as in every somewhat secular Islamic society challenged by Islamist groups, from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Erbakan became increasingly popular, and the remaining parties tried all they could to keep him out of any power, forming a weird set of coalitions of liberals, conservatives, the far right, the far left, in a secular alliance that was intent to keep them out at any means. But by 1996, Necmettin Erbakan's party had become so popular that they could no longer be kept out of power. Erbakan became the first Islamist prime minister of Turkey. However, they had greatly overestimated their power. Within a year of being in government, the Turkish army intervened and announced that if the government didn't resign, they would seize power. The great myth about this, the fourth coup in Turkish history, is that the coup itself never really took place. Merely the threat of a military coup was enough to scare the Islamists out of power. In their memories, the brutal cleansings of the last coup were still fresh, and they wished to avoid a similar bloodbath as the left had experienced amongst their own supporters. One of the defining images of this coup is a livid Erdogan climbing a podium during an Islamist rally after his mentor Erbakan had resigned, and citing a poem by the young Turk writer Ziya Gökalp.
Minareler süngü, kubbeler miğfer, camiler kışlamız, müminler asker. Allahu Ekber! Bir şey bizi sindiremez.
He was arrested and thrown in prison for a year, and it must have seemed to many within the political establishment that this Islamist mess was now over. But they couldn't have been further from the truth. During the late 90s and early 2000s, the political establishment managed to pass some significant policies, such as a normalization of relations between Turkey and Greece, which was, however, admittedly largely driven by artists and musicians in both countries. But most significantly, a refusal by Turkey to join the United States and Britain in their war against Iraq, a stance it took together with Germany and France in the hope of tying Turkey deeper into Europe. But the Islamist genie could not be forced back into the bottle, no matter what successes the political establishment could have delivered. For 7 decades, generations of Turkish politicians had pursued Ataturk's vision, and that vision mainly lay in the
Remember who you are.
West, of a Turkey and its people standing unified and as equals amongst modern nation states. But that vision had started to crumble. It was built on a nationalist vision, a vision that erased all differences in culture, and a vision that tolerated no aberrations. It made the promise of a better future, yet that future seemed to always be just around the corner. Attempts to tie Turkey into Europe crashed onto the Cyprus question time and time again, and many Turks started to see themselves as being looked down upon by their European neighbors. That no matter where the country may go, most in the West would consider them to be nothing but backward Anatolian peasants. When Erdogan was released from prison, he rejoined the Islamist political struggle, who had simply rallied into a new party, the Virtue Party, who in 1999 won several seats, including for female members in the Turkish parliament, a parliament in which it was forbidden to wear headscarves.
Türkiye'de hanımların giyim kuşamına, başörtüsüne, özel yaşamlarında hiç kimse karışmıyor. Ancak burası hiç kimsenin özel yaşam mekanı değildir. Burası devletin en yüce kurumudur. Burada görev yapanlar devletin kurallarına, geleneklerine uymak zorundadırlar. Burası devlete meydan okunacak yer değildir. Lütfen bu hanıma haddini bildiriniz. Neye hizmet edilir?
This, a famous moment in recent Turkish history, is a very uncomforting clip to watch, even if you yourself might find overt religiosity and political religiosity rejectable and
Yeah, this wasn't comfortable to watch.
be an ardent defender of secularism. This moment and the way Merve Kavakci is treated simply comes across as misogynistic. And that was the point. When Erdogan came back into Turkish politics during the late 90s, what the Islamists had specialized in were these types of targeted and deliberate provocations. Not the kind that were reactionary, but the type that turned the understanding of the modern world on its head. The veil is forced upon women in many Islamic countries, where refusal to wear it is often brutally punished. In many ways and in many countries, it is a symbol of male dominance over women. And if you ever wondered how throughout the early 2000s it was rebranded and remarketed into a symbol of women's liberation, it started here. Women who wore the veil in Turkey could not attend university, enter a public building to either stand for office, vote, or even just to apply for or receive their benefits. One group of people who were particularly maligned by all this were young single mothers who happened to be religious, an opportunity which the Islamists seized by offering them charity and also promising them a better life under a less restrictive state. The late 90s saw riots in the streets of Turkish cities like had never occurred before, not by men, zealots or leftists, but by veiled women. The political establishment had branded itself and seen itself as the liberator of women who had freed them from the shackles of religion, and with this really smart move, the Islamists made them look like the oppressors of women. The Islamists shed the image of religious zealotry. They rebranded themselves as liberators, as open people, people who wanted to protect the vulnerable from a zealous secular state and its ruthless capitalism. They also questioned the founding myth of this state. Why do we fight the Kurds? Aren't the Kurds fellow Muslims? Why not make peace with the Armenians? In these days, the Islamists even spoke on behalf of equal rights for gays and lesbians. They took on every cause which they could use to undermine the image.
Excuse me. Whoa. We don't put pineapple on no pizza. No. We can put pineapple on pizza.
Of progress and modernity that the secular political establishment had built. No longer seen as scary fanatics, even left-wing voters started rallying behind them, who saw in their message validation of theirs that had been so brutally crushed by the army. In panic, the political establishment attempted to form ever more absurd coalitions and alliances. Coalition governments of the centre-left, far-left, conservatives and far-right nationalists were supposed to keep the Islamists out, but increasingly did nothing but expose their own internal conflicts. The Supreme Court banned the Virtue Party as being anti-secular and therefore unconstitutional, but they merely reorganized into a new party, Erdogan's Justice and Development Party. The political establishment mocked Erdogan for being an uneducated peasant, an Anatolian know-nothing from the slums, but they didn't realize that his humble background is exactly what made so many Turks identify with him. Every time they mocked him, they merely made him more popular in the public eye. And as the year 2002 rolled in, the Justice and Development Party had a sweeping election victory, gaining a 2/3 majority in parliament. The country was about to undergo the most drastic changes that it had seen since Ataturk.
Okay. Well. I guess we go to part 3. And if you're interested in checking of us, let me restate that again. If you're interested in us checking out part 3, type in the comment section below so that way we can get your feedback. Everything that has a beginning must and will have an end, and every door that opens leads to a new path, doesn't it? I'm very interested in overall the history of Turkey and seeing where this goes for part 3. I would say to everybody that's watching, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and please follow Kraut's YouTube channel. I wasn't expecting the Uno reverse card, the reverse knife throw. And the reverse knife throw is in reference to, that's right, Big Trouble in Little China, where Lo Pan gets the knife in the head as soon as it's caught by our protagonist and throws it right after him. Where you have the extreme, I guess, religious political party use the Uno reverse card like, hey, how come she can't be in here? It's a kind of clever move when you think about it in regards to the realm of politics. But I had no idea about the amount of corruption and the amount of neoliberal policies that were being implemented upon the people of Turkey. More on this, and check us out on the next episode of Dragon Ball GT. Americans Learn. So if you want us to check out part 3 of this 3-part series, type in the comment section below, because I'll be tuning in. But the only way we're going to do it is if you, the people, say go ahead and do it. Until then, take good care of yourselves and each other. Peace and much love. And I'll see all of you beautiful, lovely people on the flip side. Take care.